Okay, so welcome feminists, abolitionists from around the world to this panel about how to attack the demand for the purchase of sexual acts. My name is Clara Berglund and I'm the Secretary General of the Swedish Women's Lobby, and we are an umbrella organization for the women's movement in Sweden. We have 53 member organizations that gather about 130 women and girls from all over Sweden. And I'm honored to be moderating this panel. So in the year 2000, the United Nations adopted the Palermo Protocol that requires states to take measures to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons. So demand is a very nice word, but today we are going to talk about what it really means. It means that there are men in this world that can and want to buy women's bodies, that feel that they are entitled to have access to women's bodies. And if we can infringe on that entitlement, we can protect women and create a better world where women's bodies are respected and not available for others to use. But how can it be done? That's what we're going to talk about in this panel. So during the years since the protocol was adopted, several states have introduced the kind of measures that the Palermo Protocol asked for. So Sweden was the first country in the world to criminalize sex purchase, and since then other states have followed and introduced legislation that is also better than the original. So in this panel we will learn more about the Canadian abolitionist legislation and how it's implemented. So we will get to listen to Omar Siddiqui, and you are a community prosecutor in Manitoba. And we also will have with us Rose Sullivan, who is a survivor of prostitution and also a frontline worker. And we were supposed also to hear from Rosa Hischer, and she is a hero that was instrumental in introducing the abolitionist legislation in France, and many of you know her, and she would have loved to be here today, but unfortunately cannot be here. So her name is in the program, and she's very sorry that she's not here. So we'll try to do the best we can without her. But the first we're going to listen to is Melissa Farley, and Melissa, you are a clinical psychologist, a renowned researcher, and a tireless anti-pornography and anti-prostitution activist. And I was wondering, Melissa, if you could tell us more about what we know from research about what works when it comes to targeting demand. So what will deter men from buying sex?
Thank you, Clara. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see you.
I think your mic is not on.
Where did he go? It's just not close enough. It just needs to be closer and not fall over, but it might. Yesterday, Diane Mate said, "There are no disposable women, but at the root of sex buyers' paid rape is their conviction that women are disposable commodities." One man said, "It's like buying a cup of coffee. When you're finished, you throw the cup out." Men who pay for sex are the invisible perpetrators of systems of prostitution. Our job as abolitionists is to make them visible and culpable for their crimes against women. I think the most important study of the impact of paying for sex was done by Heilman, who asked the question, what makes a boy grow up to commit rape? Heilman queried 1,000 men in each of these countries, Chile, Croatia, India, Mexico, and Rwanda. In other words, he had more than 5,000 interviewees. Just like the recent study by Stigmo in Iceland, which also had a huge sample of survivors. That's on the website of Prostitution Research and Education, a free website with many libraries about racism and colonialism, sex self-identity, prostitution, trafficking, pornography. Please check it out. So what did Heilman find? He found that one purchase of sex once increased the probability of men committing rape. One time, not 10, not every day, not every week, just once, treating a woman like a disposable commodity increased the likelihood that he would rape. We found in our research in the US, India, Scotland, Cambodia, England, and Germany that men who pay for sex are very much aware of the psychological harm of prostitution. They're good psychologists. They know as much as I do, and they know as much as many survivors do. In fact, they say the same things in confidential interviews about prostitution that survivors say. Men who pay for sex, we found, are different from men who choose not to pay for sex. We found also that sex buyers are more likely to commit rape than men who don't buy sex. And they rape non-prostituted women as well as prostituted women. We found that buying sex is connected to pornography use. Men who are prolific users of men who are prolific users of pornography are more often using women in prostitution. The more porn, the more sex buying. Our finding that sex buyers have less empathy than non-sex buyers has important implication for prevention of prostitution. Teach men empathy in primary school when they're very young. Empathy is probably more important than sex education. I want to say that again. Empathy is more important than sex education. Thanks. I'm glad you think so too. It's so obvious, but we don't talk about it enough. In the US, we teach competition, not empathy in school. How to beat out the next person. We also learned some things about what would and would not deter men who from buying sex. We asked them a checklist of 12 different deterrents. Everything from being added to a sex offender registry, they hate that the most. Men in 5 different countries, very different cultures, they don't want to be labeled sex offenders along with rapists and pedophiles. They like to think of themselves as studs, players, you know how that goes. Well-endowed dudes. Their photo in the newspaper. We asked them a lot, what would deter you with this and this and this and this? And we found that among the most effective ways of deterring men is, first of all, arresting them, and second of all, put them in jail for any amount of time. It doesn't have to be 6 months or 10 years, which some of us think they should get, but 1 hour will deter them. Why? There's a public criminal record of their behavior, which should never, ever be erased. I don't care how much counseling they have, do not erase that record. It's very important. That was one of the most effective. Now I want to tell you the sad news. An educational program about the harms of prostitution, which is almost a fad today in many locations, was the least effective of 12 different methods of deterring men from buying sex. Why? Why is having a survivor get up there looking sex buyers in the eye and saying, and I've heard these programs, survivors saying, I hated you the whole time, you were raping me, you were paying to rape me. Here's the thing. They already know that. They already know that it's paid rape. They already know the women hate it. And so having an educational program is like giving them a gift. I have strong opinions about this, as you could tell. But we've also failed to learn the lesson of the battered women's movement. In the beginning of the battered women's movement back in the 70s and 80s in the US, feminists thought that if we just sat them down and talked to them and explained, do you know when you put your fist like this and then go real fast at her nose, you might break her nose? They already knew that too. And so it's not about, we don't need counseling, we need consequences. And after the consequences, oh, I'm a psychologist, give them all the counseling they want. But don't erase that record of arrest, of criminal predatory behavior. In my country, you get a permanent record if you steal any item of furniture worth $200. That, you can't erase that on your record. We don't have diversion programs for theft, but somehow we think sex buyers should be given a pass. I say no. It's a very serious crime. We've learned this from survivors again and again and again. And if you listen to survivors, don't give sex buyers a pass on their criminal behavior. So let's not erase what we know about rape, battering, violence, poverty, racism. Let's don't erase all those factors that drive women into prostitution, which is what we're doing if we say to a John, just listen to this program for 15 minutes, pay us $5,000 and then goodbye. Let's not erase sex predation. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. I wanted to give you also a follow-up question on that. I was going to ask you about pornography, but you said some things about that already. So something that I thought about when you spoke and that we talked also about the other night. It's like the importance of empathy that you said now, but also you talk about consequences and how effective it is with, for example, public records, and that's sort of like shaming actions. Do you want to say anything about the balance between those two? Will you give the mic back?
Later.
You don't want to say it now?
I have something else to say, but I'll
Okay.
come back later. Is that okay?
All right, so just, you don't need a moderator, that's fine.
Okay, good. I'll be good, but I spent a lot of time writing this up, so because I have so little time, I have to almost read it. Clara, would you forgive me, please?
Go ahead.
Today, pornography is inseparable from non-filmed prostitution. Racism is essential to white supremacist and settler colonial cultures. Within prostitution and pornography, there is a racist hierarchy. Wherever prostitution exists, the most degraded and violent sex acts are perpetrated against certain women defined as other. Other is culturally defined by women's skin color or other ethnic characteristics. Pornography is commodified racism. It's commodified sexism, and it's commodified pornography. Pornography adds to prostitution a public, lasting record of the most humiliating moments in any woman's life. Movement. Thank you. Thank you for...
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you also for your research and your work that has been quoted so many times during these last days. So I am going to introduce now Rose Sullivan. And Rose, you are a survivor of prostitution, you are a brave activist, you are an outreach worker for an organization here in Quebec called Le Sortie. Is that correct? This was my research that I did.
Je suis pas travailleuse sociale, je suis technicienne en travail social. C'est un peu moins payé puis un peu moins d'études.
Okay,
Mais
thank you.
Le reste,
Thank you.
Le reste, c'est vrai.
And so thank you for the important work that you do and for being here with us. And I wanted to ask you from your perspective as a survivor and frontline worker, what do you think are the most effective way to deter men from buying sex? And also, if you can say some things about your view of the implementation of the Canadian law that we will hear more about, also from the prosecutor's perspective in a little bit. So please go ahead.
Mais je pense que Mélissa a répondu à la question en partie en expliquant que la sensibilisation fait une partie, mais que des fois les conséquences sont nécessaires. Puis suite à quelques journées de sensibilisation auprès de clients qui ont été arrêtés, que j'ai eu, je ne sais pas si j'aurais dit la chance ou l'opportunité d'animer. Bref, j'ai été la chanceuse qui a tenté d'éduquer des hommes qui s'étaient fait arrêter. Puis je suis pas chercheuse, puis j'ai observé, puis je les ai écoutés. Puis moi et ma collègue, on a eu beaucoup de plaisir à leur expliquer qu'on était à l'écoute et qu'on voulait leurs commentaires parce qu'on était vraiment intrigués par ce qu'ils avaient à dire. Puis c'est vrai que la majorité des hommes ont avoué candidement que s'ils ne s'étaient pas fait arrêter, soit ils n'auraient pas su qu'il y avait une loi, soit ils se seraient dit qu'on s'en fout parce qu'elle n'est pas appliquée. Puis c'est ceux qui ont eu le plus peur, qui ont été le plus à l'écoute selon moi. Là. Ceux qui sont mariés ont vraiment, vraiment eu plus peur que ceux qui ne le sont pas. Puis je me rappelle qu'à la fin de chaque journée, je me suis dit qu'il y avait peut-être quelques petits privilèges qu'on pourrait leur enlever encore. Là, comme celui de faire en sorte de presque tout faire, ma foi. Pour vrai, je ne sais pas à quel point ça prend d'énergie aux gens qui s'occupent de ces journées-là pour que la femme ne la prenne pas. Puis je comprends que c'est pas sa faute à elle. Puis je me dis que peut-être que c'est mieux pour elle. Mais on dirait que j'avais la femme en tête plus que l'homme. Puis je trouve ça important de parler des clients aussi, plutôt que les femmes, mais je trouve qu'il ne faut jamais, jamais, jamais perdre de vue les victimes en arrière. Et c'est vrai que les hommes qui n'ont pas d'empathie, on aura beau leur raconter. Limite, moi, des fois, j'ai eu peur qu'il y en ait qui soient en train de fantasmer, là, tu sais. Fait que, je veux dire, il ne faut jamais perdre de vue qu'il y a... On voit souvent juste la pointe de l'iceberg. Fait qu'un homme qui s'est fait arrêter, puis je parle des pires que j'ai rencontrés dans cette occasion-là, ceux qui se permettaient encore d'être un peu arrogants, opposants, puis de remettre en question. Je veux dire, moi, j'ai aucune difficulté à imaginer qu'ils sont juste pas sensibilisables. Fait que, il y a beaucoup de travail à faire, en fait, au niveau c'est plus que de l'éducation, puis je considère qu'il faut absolument qu'on continue dans cette voie-là. Peu importe les critiques de je ne sais quelle organisation ou lobby pro-travail du sexe et autres qui ont des intérêts à ce que ça continue puis qui font de l'argent avec ça. Fait que, puis c'est ça, ça c'est une des choses qu'il faut faire, je pense, pour que la loi soit plus appliquée. Mais j'ai l'impression qu'on se casse beaucoup la tête pour le confort des hommes. Puis comme le disait ma collègue Valérie hier, on ne devrait pas se forcer autant pour aménager la sexualité des hommes. C'est pas le devoir d'une société de faire en sorte que les hommes soient donc heureux. Toujours pas plus que les femmes. Je veux dire, le thème du congrès, c'est l'égalité en action. Puis j'ai eu l'impression, même avec les journées de sensibilisation, même lors des journées de sensibilisation, j'ai eu l'impression que les hommes étaient plus privilégiés, puis qu'il y avait... C'était très important, là, que, je ne sais pas si c'est parce qu'ils étaient plus à l'écoute ou quoi que ce soit, mais je serais vraiment curieuse de savoir à quel point ça fonctionne. Puis je considère qu'il ne devrait pas avoir de privilèges parce qu'ils participent à une journée de sensibilisation. Ça devrait être un plus, ça devrait être obligé, mais ça ne devrait pas faire en sorte que leur vie continue, mine de rien. Il y en a un client qui l'a carrément dit, après ça a été fait arrêter, qui s'en allait s'en rechercher une. Là. Puis, je veux dire, j'ai eu moi-même des hommes contre qui j'ai essayé de porter plainte, mais c'était impossible avant la loi. Là. Je pense que le policier, limite, est un client, mais je veux dire, tu sais, le policier a appelé le client qui me harcelait, puis je n'étais même pas sorti du poste, puis il me rappelait, là. Fait que c'est pas des tapes sur les doigts que ça prend, là, tu sais, puis je suis pas chercheuse, puis j'ai beaucoup de titres, mais je suis une maman, là, puis il y a toute une vague de psychopathes qui a existé, puis qui a fait des enfants, j'ose dire, un peu gâtés, là, qui sont comme, tu sais, on a peut-être, tu sais, c'est de plus en plus documenté, là, qu'il y a peut-être une génération complète qu'on a été un petit peu trop doux avec. Tu sais, c'est beau l'ouverture, mais ça a ses limites. Puis des fois, c'est des conséquences que ça prend. Puis je vois pas pourquoi on traiterait des hommes qui achètent qui achètent le consentement d'une femme mieux qu'on traite un enfant. Là, je me dis, si tu n'es pas capable de compter, comme le dit Mélissa, ils savent, les hommes qui font du mal. Puis en tant qu'ancienne escorte, je sais qu'ils savent. Il y en a qui se sentaient mal. C'est pas pour rien qu'ils passent une demi-heure à nous dire que c'est la faute à leur femme s'ils sont là, puis qui ont donc bien besoin de se faire dire qu'on aime ça, puis que c'est notre choix, puis qui ne bandent pas si on n'est plus capable. Excusez, là, c'est cru, mais... désolé au traducteur aussi. Mais je veux dire, vraiment, les hommes ont besoin de se faire dire qu'on aime ça, parce qu'au fond d'eux, ils savent très bien que c'est faux. Puis, je vois pas pourquoi des hommes comme ça, on s'imagine qu'en faisant comme là, c'est pas gentil ce que tu fais, puis qu'on leur répète, que ça je vois pas pourquoi on fait ça, en fait. T'sais. J'ai participé aux journées de sensibilisation, je suis contente de l'avoir fait, puis je pense pas que ça devrait pas exister, mais je pense que ça devrait pas donner de privilèges supplémentaires aux hommes. Puis, c'est plate, mais c'est vrai que les conséquences, ça fonctionne. Puis, je veux dire, j'ai eu des conséquences vraiment pires que certains hommes pour m'être trompé d'une virgule dans les instants. Voilà. Je peux continuer. Je pense que j'ai répondu.
But thank you, Rose, for taking us with you into those rooms and conversations. I want to follow up on something that you said that I also heard yesterday, that in Canada there has been little public awareness raising about the legislation, and that you meet men that they say that they don't know that it's illegal. And if that's the case, maybe they're lying, maybe it's true, I don't know. But do you think that there is some need to do some efforts to raise public awareness about the education, and what have you done so far, and what do you think is needed? For example, public campaigns, or including abolitionist principles in sexuality education, or something like that. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Je pourrais en parler longtemps. On a fait beaucoup d'activités. Puis, excusez, c'est la traduction dans mes oreilles, des fois c'est un peu. Fait que, oui, on a fait beaucoup d'activités. Il y a eu, ça fait 10 ans que la loi est passée, on en parlait même avant. Je pense qu'on a fait beaucoup. On a fait ce qu'on pouvait pour sensibiliser en tant tant le mouvement des survivantes que les organisations qui militent. Mais j'ai envie de parler de ce qu'on fait pas. Je dois me permettre de parler de ce qu'on fait pas. Je pense que, c'est ça, je parle des organisations qui militent parce qu'il y a des organisations qui ne le font pas. Puis si on retourne à la base du féminisme, je vais dire le mot radical, comme dans Racine, pas comme dans extrême, il y a le fait que la reprise de pouvoir des femmes passe notamment par la militance. Fait que je ne prêche pas pour ma paroisse, mais c'est parce que c'est pas une paroisse, c'est un emploi. Je travaille dans un organisme qui ne milite pas, mais j'ai le droit de militer en tant que moi-même, ce qui est bien quand même. Puis c'est un organisme qui se dit pas féministe. Mais un organisme qui se dit féministe et qui milite pas, je trouve qu'il manque quelque chose. N'importe qui se dit égalitaire, puis qui a une militante parfaite à ses yeux, une survivante parfaite à aider, je trouve qu'il manque de problème. Il manque de cohérence, en fait. C'est ça. Je trouve qu'on a fait beaucoup pour sensibiliser. Puis si ça n'a pas encore fonctionné, je pense que c'est beaucoup à cause d'un manque de cohérence. Peut-être un manque de participation des femmes concernées. Puis on sait que c'est pas facile de militer en tant que survivante. Mais des fois, je me questionne à savoir, puis je m'inclus là-dedans, est-ce qu'on fait vraiment tout ce qu'il faut pour faciliter la participation des survivantes? Je ne crois pas. Et puis... Puis aussi, j'ai perdu mon idée, mais ça va revenir. Ça s'en vient. J'ai pris mes médicaments un peu en retard ce matin. Merci. Incohérence, c'est ça. Il y a beaucoup d'incohérences et... Voilà, merci. Et dans la loi aussi, notamment, puis je ne comprends pas, je veux dire, je pense pas qu'il y a de loi qui permettent d'arrêter ce genre de personnes-là. Je pense que je vais la nommer. Il y a Sandra Wesley, notamment, qui se trouve être une directrice d'organisme, ou je ne sais pas. Son titre a changé. Je la nomme parce que c'est elle que j'ai lue dernièrement et sans arrêt. Puis il y en a d'autres, mais je veux dire que des organisations subventionnées puissent mentir dans les médias, puis qu'il n'y ait pas de tape ses doigts et continue d'avoir des subventions, je crois. C'est toujours être juste pignon sur rue, ça, je trouve que ça n'a aucun sens. Quand je lis que les femmes sont criminalisées dans la prostitution, alors que ça fait 10 ans que c'est plus le cas, non seulement ça me fâche parce que c'est faux, mais c'est parce que ça met des femmes en danger. Il y a des femmes qui m'appellent puis qui font comme... Ils cherchent comment faire en sorte de ne pas être criminalisés, puis sont prêtes à se mettre en danger parce qu'ils ont lu qu'ils étaient criminalisés. Fait que là, on n'est plus dans la sensibilisation des clients, on est dans le fait de sauver la vie de femmes. Et je pense que je vais conclure en disant que j'ai été infirmière, j'ai une tante qui travaille en oncologie. J'en parlais avec une collègue hier, il n'y a jamais eu autant de décès parmi les femmes qu'on soutient. Fait que c'est beau la sensibilisation, mais je pense qu'on doit aller à un autre niveau à un moment donné. Là. Autant dans l'aide aux femmes, le soutien très concret aux femmes, que la reprise de pouvoir par la militance. Les femmes veulent militer, puis j'ai l'impression qu'il y en a, les femmes que j'ai connues qui ont eu l'occasion de militer, je pense à une de mes comparses qui est peut-être là ou non, qui devait arrêter, qui ne pouvait pas militer parce qu'elle était en processus judiciaire. Je dis, ça va tellement mieux depuis qu'elle peut. C'est ça la reprise de pouvoir, c'est pas juste un mot, c'est l'approche féministe, le féminisme radical, la base, l'égalité pour vrai, pas juste sur papier. Je pense que c'est toutes des choses qui vont faire que la sensibilisation va être beaucoup plus efficace. Puis je parle autant en tant qu'individu qui aide des femmes, puis je parle à moi autant qu'aux autres, puis qu'organisations, que représentants. Je veux dire, on a toutes des lacunes, on a toutes une possibilité de s'améliorer. On a tout un examen de conscience à faire, puis je pense qu'il disait c'est la faute à lui, c'est la faute à lui, c'est la faute aux hommes, c'est la faute à tout le monde, mais nous, on a décidé qu'on allait travailler pour les femmes. Fait que je pense que c'est important qu'on le fasse de façon cohérente puis honnête, parce que les femmes qu'on aide s'attendent à des services cohérents, honnêtes et minimalement égalitaires pour vrai, puis c'est ça. Je pense qu'il faut intégrer toutes les femmes. Je sais qu'on n'est pas évident. Je sais que des fois, on a des humeurs instables. Des fois, on est très anxieux. Des fois, on n'est pas pantoute. Des fois, on est gelé. Des fois, on est à jeun. Des fois, c'est des drogues légales qui nous gèlent. Des fois, non. Des fois, on l'assume trop. Mais je veux dire, c'est pas nous qu'on a décidé que telle personne ou telle organisation allait exister puis nous aider. Nous, on est allés vers ces organisations-là et on fait juste espérer une fois de plus puis croire en l'humanité. Une fois de plus. Fait que je pense que c'est important de ne pas comme redécevoir, revictimiser encore les femmes qu'on prétend aider. Et je m'inclus là. C'est pas une critique, là, c'est un examen de conscience que je fais à voix haute, puis que j'invite tout le monde à faire. Je pense que... C'est de pouvoir faire des mots, quitte à aller lire les définitions. Là, le mot radical, c'est pas un méchant mot. Puis, tu sais, le mot, l'abolition de la prostitution, je sais qu'ici, les gens savent qu'on n'est pas des méchantes prohibitionnistes, là, mais je veux dire, il y a des mots qu'on utilise entre nous puis qui font peur. Quand j'utilise le mot radical, je vois certaines intervenantes puis certaines militantes faire comme « wow », puis je suis comme « non, on va discuter ». Puis il faut définir, tu sais, fait que avant d'avoir peur des mots, il faut aller lire ce que ça veut dire. Puis je vous invite aussi à consulter tout ce que Florence Moreno a écrit à propos des mots et de l'importance des mots. C'est vraiment, c'est la base, tu sais, je pense qu'il faut qu'on retourne à la base avant de commencer à comme rajouter des petites fleurs et des fioritures à nos programmes puis à nos trucs, là, la base.
Thank you so much for that, Rose. And now I want to properly introduce Omar Siddiqui. So welcome to this radical room. You are a community prosecutor in the Canadian province of Manitoba, and you work in practice to end the impunity of sex buyers and pimps, and for women in prostitution to get legal redress. So please, if you could tell us a few words about the work that you do and how it's working, and how you get sex buyers are brought to justice, and what is the key to success, you think?
Hello, okay, thank you. I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional territory that we're on. I want to acknowledge the First Peoples of this territory. This is unceded territory that's significant. I bring you greetings from Treaty 1 territory. It's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Lakota, the Nakota, the Dakota, the Cree, the Dene, and also the traditional land of the MMF, which is the Red River Métis. I want to say and begin with that. I also want to acknowledge all of the survivors in the room. You know, I don't know what I can say other than I do honor you. I honor your stories. I honor what you bring to the room. I honor your ancestors that have given you the courage and the strength to be here today. I also honor all the life givers in the room. That's a word we use in Treaty 1 territory. It's not a reference to the ability to give birth. It's a reference to the fact that people who identify as women, they bring life to our communities. They've been given that gift that they instill life. They are the guardians of life, so I just want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge the life givers in my life. I want to acknowledge my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and I'll also acknowledge my partner as well. The reason I want to acknowledge them is because while you know, other kids were out playing, my mother sat me down and was telling me about colonization. So I have to acknowledge that memory, and one of the first things she told me about colonization is the way they began to conquer us was they attacked the status of women in our communities. So I want to acknowledge that because I think it's important, because this is a gender defense. 286.1 of the Criminal Code in Canada talks about the crime of obtaining or communicating for the purposes of obtaining sexual services for commodification. It is under the heading, and we talked about headings initially, it's under the heading of commodification of sexual activity. So I think that's important to mention because commodification is something that is natural to a capitalist system. So what commodification does is that it is the title of dehumanization. It is the dehumanization of humanity, it is the dehumanization of human dignity, it is the reduction of a person to an object. I just want to begin by saying that, and I think it's important to acknowledge that from the very start. And sometimes some of the struggles I have with judges, oftentimes in the context of a sentencing after a conviction, is effectively trying to, and this is a struggle because this is a colonial system that, which the currency is the sacrifice of our human dignity, right? So trying to get those of us who have been educated in a system that doesn't value particularly the human dignity of people of color, how to attach a sentencing consequence to the violation and the lack of recognition of human dignity. How do you do that? How do you teach a system that's about dehumanization how to rehumanize? And that's something that I consistently struggle with. For myself also, because I went to Osgoode, I was raised in a settler system. I struggled trying to understand what a non-settler, non-colonial legal system looks like. But those are the questions that come to my mind. So I just want to begin by that very quickly. What I do, I've been a prosecutor for 20 years. I was 10 years as a drug prosecutor, 10 years as everything else prosecutor. I'm responsible for the therapeutic courts, mental health court, drug treatment court. I can talk to you about that later. I'm also responsible for prosecuting these offenses. And I want to thank you for mentioning the programming, because I inherited a system where when someone is arrested for violating, and to back up, almost every single one of my cases involve undercover operations. Okay, there is a lack of trust between those who are being exploited and the police, and one of the primary things I hear is because police officers are in the exploitation. That's another conversation to have, and that's something I learned from the racialized women, and some of whom are trans women, particularly Indigenous, who talked about how they were victimized by police officers, and there is that issue that needs to be built. So what happens is it is a team of, at the minimum, 7 or 8 individuals. They keep asking me to come on a sting with them. I keep telling them my mom won't let me. My mom is a really racialized female. She thinks if I go on a sting, they're going to set me up and put me in jail for drugs. I'm like, Mom, I'm a prosecutor. It's not going to happen. But that's what she thinks. And she knows the chief of police, but she just, don't trust them. Okay, anyway. So what happens is there's a surveillance team, there's an undercover officer and there's 2 levels of prosecutors. And I'm originally a drug trafficker. So what I did as a drug trafficker is there were differentiations in the level of the drug regime, right? There were more serious, more culpable ways. There's the street level traffickers. There's the ones who hold high levels of cocaine. And so the only reason I apply that logic is because I'm attempting to get the courts to recognize the increased danger of the prostitution or the exploitation that happens in hotels versus the streets when there's no escape. So I just want to talk to you a bit about that later. But anyway, they set up either on the street. There's 2 locations in our city. Those locations are directly connected to colonization. Those 2 locations in our city, the West End and the North End, are known as areas which are primarily racialized, and specifically are areas where a lot of the Indigenous community find themselves, particularly when they come from reserves. So there is an element of colonization from the very start of the setting up the undercover operation. And so I just want to acknowledge the fact that we cannot ignore the fact that the foundation of this country was land theft, that the land is our mother, and so the exploitation of the earth is the exploitation of the feminine. And I think it's very, I'm only able to share this with you is because my partner identifies as Indigenous. My 3rd child is Indigenous. I was introduced to the Sundance. I'm learning to understand that. So I can't ignore that. And so oftentimes when I go to this programming and I talk to people, I say, look, what you're doing is a continuation of colonization. When the European system came here and saw a matriarchal system, and because they didn't see women as human to begin with, that was the first thing they did. That was a threat. That was a threat. They did it all over the world, first of all. And I tell the people in my group who are racialized, I'm like, if you actually go back to your traditions and your cultures, would you actually appreciate the status of women? Anyway, that's a sidebar. Anyway, so what happens is the undercover operation happens as an individual on the street. They just stand there, either in the streets, or they make an advertisement for a hotel in Winnipeg, and the men, because it's all men, they're driving by, they see the undercover standing in this area, they approach them, there's an interaction. That interaction is the basis of my prosecution, everything that's said at that point. Usually on the street, it's like, hey, there's some law about what the undercover officer can say. The undercover officer can't include the elements of the offense in the communication. They can't just say, hey, would you like to violate section 286 of the code? It doesn't work like that. They're approached, and usually at the street level, you begin to see the contempt. $10 for a blowjob, $5. Usually the officers will be, they'll be like, how much? And the undercover officers are very good. They say, well, I'm pretty desperate. And then they're like, okay, here's $5. And so I begin to talk about the sheer level of contempt for the humanity of the undercover officer at that point. And then there's other forms of traffic, other forms of consideration, which are deemed worse. When, for example, it's -30 in Winnipeg and say, I'll give you a ride for something. Or there's in some situations, people have offered methamphetamine or cocaine, thinking that that's going to get them the sexual act that they want. Of course, it's an undercover, so they're arrested. At the hotels, Just as a sidebar, $20 on the streets, we're talking $500 in the hotel, so different demographic, right? So when I go and I speak to the groups, I can see that demographic, that primarily the street levels are first of all, we're talking like 19 to 70. Like I don't know if anybody has in their mind a stereotype of like, a middle-class male with a mustache, like, no, that's not the case, or a middle-aged man. It's 19 to 20 and all across the spectrum of race. All across the spectrum, so there's no demographic other than the fact that they're male. But at least at the street level, I can say the socioeconomic status of the individual is less, and at the hotel level, obviously people are dropping $500, $600, because what happens is they communicate via text, usually through Leo List or something like that. They meet in a hotel, they send a menu, they choose the menu, they walk into the room, and also, just for the purposes of sentencing, I try to communicate to judges, the undercover officers are at extreme risk because literally they tell me the men are coming in and they're taking their pants off right there and then, like as they walk in, at least in the street you can run away technically. So that's part of the conversations I have. That's just to give you an idea of the mechanics of the prosecution. The prosecution itself is very straightforward. It's a one-day trial. I call police witnesses. They're professional witnesses. They give their testimony. The surveillance officer says, the only thing I'm really worried about is the continuity of the person. From the very start of the interaction to the very end, is it the same person? What was said? What was said? What was communicated? And then usually these individuals, they take the stand. I can tell you my experience. They'll say, oh, I was joking. Thankfully, the judges don't believe that. Oh, I don't speak English. I'm like, you pointed at your crotch. Like, I don't understand. Like, what language other than the communication for the purposes of obtaining sexual services is that? I had once in a while, the last trial I had an individual said, there's nothing wrong with this. I had no problem with this whatsoever. And so I asked for a year custody for that person. A year. I need no criminal record. And one of the challenges I face, and I appreciate why the sentencing regime is what it is in 286.1 of the criminal code, there is a minimum fine. The minimum fine is there, so you can't go before the judge and ask for a conditional discharge. There is a mandatory minimum, so you can't get a discharge. But I struggle with asking for a fine when what they did in the first place was monetize human dignity. So what I'm doing in asking for a fine is I'm continuing the monetization of the process. And I appreciate why it's there, and I'm not trying to disrespect those who made this law and put it in place. Maybe they were thinking so someone can stand up in court and ask for a discharge. But I have yet to ask for a fine because I just can't get myself to do it. And so what happens is, though, the fine communicates to the court, because you get a fine for, you used to get a fine for simple possession of cocaine. Thankfully, we don't prosecute simple possession anymore. You used to get a fine for speeding. Like, you get a fine for a parking ticket. What does that tell you? What does it tell you about the value and the dignity that we place on life givers, right? So I try to communicate this to the court. I try to tell them, look, Mr. Siddiqui, the sentence asked for a fine. And what they're saying is, that's what the parliament wants. The people of Canada want a fine attached to this. I don't think anyone in this room wants a fine. You're part of the people of this country. And then I say to them, well, then notwithstanding that, I would like custody. And they always say, and this is something I'm beginning to do because it bothers me, because I've come to places like this where I'm like, I can't stand up and ask for a fine. How do I attach humanity back to a process? Well, the issue is custody. And I appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that this is how it happens when someone's arrested for the first time. I can give you the numbers. I've done 5 John sweeps, 30 people minimum in each of that's upwards to, and this is only when they do sweeps. We're talking about upwards to 100 people every single year going through this program. If they did sweep, and I spoke to the officer before I came today, if they did a sweep every single day, they pick up 40 people every single day. Do the math. How many people that is? And I don't even see the same people. So it's like this generation upon generation upon generation of people who think it's okay to buy sex. And so I just want to add that at the first level, when someone is arrested, if they don't have a criminal record they put into the programming, I accept. That is a decision the police make, and I've struggled with that. I don't feel good. I don't feel good when I go talk to a room of people who buy sex. I don't feel good telling them you're getting this chance, you're not getting a criminal record. At least they went through the arrest process, okay, that's good. But I can tell you, if you have anything on your criminal record and you're picked up for this, you come to my desk. And then I'm going to prosecute you. When I first inherited the system, yes, okay. I apologize. I inherited a system where I was told that, okay, sometimes people should get diversion again, even if it comes to the crime. I don't do that anymore. I tell their lawyers I'm asking for custody. I tell their lawyers there needs to be a consequence. I tell their lawyers, look, and there is a consequence. Even the HTA, the Highway Traffic Act, bans you from driving from here. Sometimes they're more scared about that. Am I good? Right? And the only issue I have to say is the conversation about restorative justice as a mechanism for combating the injustices of the justice system, I don't think it applies to predators. Okay? I don't think it applies to this section, and I've had to struggle with that because when I ask for custody, the judge is like, well, Mr. Sudike, what about the principle of restraint? I don't think the principle of restraint applies. I'm sorry. I don't think it applies when it comes to the dehumanization of our life givers. I don't think it applies to this section. And I want to thank all those people who spoke before about the connection between this and sexual assault. I'm going to really think about this, because if the exchange of consideration vitiates consent, then why? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to say this. If the exchange of consideration vitiates consent, maybe we should think about laying some charges of more than just consideration. Maybe we should think about charges laying for sexual assault. Because really, that's where we're putting our money or our methods. And finally, I'm just going to say one thing. The issue of programming, I understand. The last time I went to a session like this, one of the elders from the indigenous community said, I feel like you're treating the men as the victims. I feel like you're treating the men as the victims, and that hit me very hard, it hit me very deeply. And then I realized at that moment that this is a system that was created under the auspices of an idea that said only men are valued. So of course, the inertia will always be towards that. The inertia will always be towards giving a break to those who the system was set up for. Okay, and I was telling someone earlier, our system is really great at prosecuting white men who hurt white men. That's it. Like, everything else we kind of struggle with. That's kind of messed up. So I just want to say all that. I've got a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are so lucky to have you inside this system with this commitment and this understanding. And we are running out of time. I promised Iluta that this would never happen to me, but here we are. So we have to wrap this up. And I know that both Rose and Melissa wanted to say something, but it has to be like one word. You know, it has to be very. Can you do that?
10 words.
No?
We have research data that the criminal records of sex buyers would surprise you. These are not banal crimes that men who pay for sex are committing. In addition to prostitution, they commit more homicides, more break-ins, more burglaries, more sexual assaults, more imitating a police officer, which is the way you get into a woman's home and rape her. They commit very serious crimes against women, much more, along with prostitution, which is also a serious crime against women. So I'd like to encourage prosecutors and law enforcement to look very deep at the criminal records of sex buyers.
Okay, we really have to finish one word.
Puis je ne sais pas trop comment terminer avec tout ça, mais tu sais, juste en rappelant que la culture du viol est vraiment indissociable de la prostitution. Puis je pense que c'est important qu'on intervienne, que ce soit en tant qu'humain, en tant que policier, peu importe ce qu'on fait dans la vie. Si on veut vraiment soutenir les femmes et abolir la prostitution, je pense qu'il ne faut pas avoir peur de s'interposer dès qu'il y a le moindre risque pour la liberté des femmes, l'égalité qui passe par l'abolition de la prostitution. Si vraiment on y croit, même, je veux dire, il y a des domaines dans lesquels on ne peut pas être inflexible, puis je pense que c'en est un. Il faut mettre les femmes en priorité, laisser la place aux femmes et aux survivantes, idéalement le plus possible, aux expertes aussi, aux experts ensuite. Et puis, c'est ça, prendre la place qui nous revient et ne pas avoir peur de le dire quand ça n'a pas de sens. Puis surtout, ne pas punir, ne pas faire en sorte que les gens qui osent défendre les femmes, l'abolition, le mouvement féministe ou l'égalité, faut pas que ces personnes-là aient peur de le défendre. Peu importe pourquoi, peu importe comment. C'est les personnes qui défendent l'égalité et l'abolition et le droit des femmes d'exister qui vont faire en sorte qu'on va aller vers une société plus égalitaire et plus juste. Fait que, il faut les encourager, peu importe ce qu'ils font pour y arriver, pas On leur dit.
Thank you.
On les empêche.
Thank you, Rose. Okay, so am I going to just say also just a few last words? No, you are all right. So I just hope that you feel how much support in this room for the work that you are doing.
This is. I don't know how to say this other than I don't want to make this about you supporting me. This is, I've heard you, and I think the process of the transformation of our system is going to be long, but listening here and sitting here, I've been very honored, and I've learned so much from all of you, and I absolutely believe, yes, it needs to be women-led, it needs, in some specific cases, it needs to be Indigenous-led, and I just want to be, I'm very humbled and honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for listening a few minutes extra.